The third volume in Joshua Williamson's ongoing Superman series, The Dark Path, is a fun magical adventure with a great guest star, but unfortunately is merely an event companion book that doesn't quite stand on its own. Let me know down in the comments what you guys thought of these issues. I'm Brennan for the New Wave Nerds. Subscribe down below for more nerd content and commentary. Now let's roll the intro. The Dark Path, if there's anything that makes Superman uneasy, it's magic. But the events of Night Terrors and the defeat of Insomnia have taught Kal-El that he doesn't have to face everything alone either. Enter Zatanna, the mistress of magic. She'll join Superman as they take on a new threat from powerful forces led by none other than the highly pragmatic and strategic Amanda Waller. An absolute power, absolute must read. It's a couple absolutes there. This is written by Joshua Williamson and penciled by Jamal, Campbell, and Tom Reilly. Now, as always, we're going to begin with a brief, non-spoiler review. This book I do think is fun. I think it is, again, keeping in tune with the rest of my commentary on these volumes. It's well written by Joshua Williamson. I think the characters feel like themselves, and I think the Absolute Power tie-in issues, which are penciled by Jamal Campbell, of course, look beautiful. You've heard me talk about Jamal Campbell a bunch over these past couple weeks, and I will say that also the art by Tom Reilly in the Night Terrors? Yes, in the Night Terrors event is pretty decent as well. Of course, I like Jamal Campbell's work a little bit more than Tom Reilly's, but they both look beautiful. Unfortunately, like I said in the intro, this is really an event companion book, and so because of that, it relies heavily on stuff that is happening during this, before, after, all of it. And so because of that, it doesn't necessarily stand on its own. And so if I were going to purchase, the only reason that I would buy this volume is if I was going to try and complete the entire ongoing Superman series, which is probably something that I will do. So DC's going to get my money anyways. But if you're looking for something to read, I don't know if this necessarily adds a whole lot to the character and to the overarching Superman narrative. Now, let's get into, before we get into the spoiler section, I'm going to very politely ask you all to head on over to patreon.com/newwavenerds. If you like the work that we do here and want to help us make these videos, and or if you're listening to the podcast, sound and look even better, then that is the place to go. We're doing a patron drive right now where if we get 15 new patrons or hit $50 a month, which just about covers our podcast hosting fees, then Shade and I are going to do a very special 12-part video docu-series going in depth into DC's Crisis on Infinite Earths. We're going to take a look at it issue by issue, breaking down the story, giving our reviews, talking about ways that this could be adapted in the future, all of that and more, but only available if you head on over to patreon.com/newwavenerds. Now, to get into the spoiler section of this comic, we're going to begin with Chapter 1, Absolute Power. The issues in this volume tie into two different events. The first that is collected is the second that happens chronologically, and that is Absolute Power, which is written by Mark Waid. Now, as I've talked about in previous reviews, I'm not a huge fan of Absolute Power. I'm not going to go too deep into it now. Unfortunately, I think the event itself is just a little too short. It needs a few more than 4 issues by my reckoning. But as far as the Superman tie-ins go, I do think that they add something to the major event, but if you read these issues without the event, I feel like you miss a whole bunch. You just miss basically everything of the story. You miss the entire reason why we are here, why Superman has to go into the dark paths with Zatanna. You miss all of that. And I think the comic does a decent job of recapping the events of Absolute Power. Of course, we have the little blurb at the beginning of each issue, and there are parts where we see flashbacks of things that happen in Absolute Power. But so because of that, I think if you were reading this month to month, if you were reading this as the event came out, then I think it was a really, really good read. However, if you're looking at it back, if you're looking back on it now, they really, I don't think they necessarily do a great job by themselves, right? Like, this is an event companion book. I don't know, honestly, if this should have been collected. I don't know if this should be the third volume of the Superman series. I get because you need something to collect these few issues that tie into Absolute Power, which are in the mainline Superman series. But I think it would have been better served if you had just done an Absolute Power omnibus, which I'm sure they either will release or have already released. And you just should not have collected these issues in a Superman volume. I think if you are trying to do all of this, sorry, I'm trying to look up if there's an omnibus here at the same time. There is, in fact, well, I don't know if it actually has an omnibus. I think it is just the main series hardcover. I wonder if there's any tie-in issues that are included in this. Not really. So the only place to read these Superman tie-in issues in a collected format is in this book. I think you'd be much better served to just do an Absolute Power omnibus. But in any case, I think if you are just reading through the Superman volumes and you get to this, I think you miss out a whole bunch. I think you don't really understand anything. Like I said, I mean, there are flashbacks that happen that sort of explain some things, but the events that happen in the main Absolute Power event are like pretty Superman centric. I mean, it's an event that takes on the entire DC universe, but some of the major plot points are very, very Superman centric. And so to see the aftermath of those, but to not actually see the events themselves, I think is a bit of a misstep here. I really do. I think I'm not going to go too in depth on this because, again, it happens in the Absolute Power series, and maybe one of these days we'll take a look back and review that or do it for one of our event analyses like we're doing for Crisis on Infinite Earths or something. But in the second or third issue, it's revealed that Amanda Waller has used Brainiac tech, which she has retrieved after the House of Brainiac event, to essentially control and manipulate John Kent, the son of Clark and Lois. So this is I think at this point he is still Superboy. Or no, he would have taken the mantle of Superman at this point, I think. In any case, he's taken over by Amanda Waller, and she uses him to attack the heroes, and it all results in the complete destruction of the Fortress of Solitude. Those are two very Superman-centric events, and they're barely touched on in this series. And again, this is the type of thing where you would think these events would have a really deep impact on Superman. And to be honest, they really don't. It sort of seems like Superman, there's one moment in, I think, the second tie-in issue, after they fully enter the dark paths, where Superman freaks out a little bit and starts punching the wall, saying Amanda Waller took my son, stuff like this. That's the only time it's really addressed. I mean, like I said, there are a few flashbacks, but again, I'm not a parent, I'm not a father, so this is complete conjecture. But I would imagine that if my son had been taken over by somebody evil and turned into, an unscrupulous killing machine and destroyed my home, I'd probably be a little more upset than punching the wall for one panel. You know what I mean? I don't know. Again, pure conjecture. Especially somebody who's as loving as Clark, somebody whose family is as important to him as Clark, you would think that would sort of cast a shadow over the entire remaining two tie-in issues, and it really honestly doesn't. And that's one situation where I'm like, all right, Mr. Williamson, we could have done with a little bit more here. Like, we could have actually spent a little bit more time dealing with some of the emotional impacts here, especially because apart from that, it feels like not really all that much else happens. But in any case, yeah, I think the way that it ties into Absolute Power, I think, is good if you're reading the Absolute Power event. But if you're just reading this as a standalone volume, which is, of course, what I did for the purposes of this review, it doesn't necessarily work. And so I don't know if it's worth the probably $15 that it is. I don't know how much they do these collections for these days. I haven't bought a trade paperback that was a recent release in quite a long time. So I don't know. I think it's probably $15, and I don't know if it's worth it, to be honest with you, which sucks because, again, I really like Joshua Williamson's writing, and I really adore adore and love the art of Jamal Campbell, but it's not a very well collected trade, in my opinion. But let's actually talk about the events of the story itself, and to do that, we're going to have to get into Chapter 2, Clark the Conjurer. As we read in the synopsis for the book, if there's anything that makes Superman uneasy, it's magic. And so because of that, I am a big fan of anything that puts Superman against magic. I think it can be really interesting. It's a really fun story device, and it makes it so that you can put Superman against something that puts him at a disadvantage that isn't just kryptonite. You know, I love kryptonite. I think it's a great idea. I think it's really fun that it was introduced in the, the radio serial, and I'm glad that it made the leap over to movies and comic books. But sometimes it's a little bit overused, and I think that you can break that up by introducing a little bit more magic. One of my favorite storylines for Superman in the recent years happened in, I want to say it was Action Comics like 1050 something or 1060 something. I don't know. I don't have the exact numbering off the top of my head anymore. I believe it's actually written by Jason Aaron, which is sort of a fun pull. And it's all about Superman dealing with Bizarro, who has become magical. And that, to me, is so interesting. And so, again, I obviously love the conceit that we're dealing with right at the outset here. Superman against magic is something that is really, really cool to me. And it also allows you to introduce a character whom you don't necessarily see Superman interact all that much, who I have a great affinity for more recently, and that is Zatanna. It is written by Jason Aaron and illustrated by John Timms. I think it's just a 3-issue arc from Action Comics 1061 to 1063. That's really fun. It's a good recommendation, but not what we're talking about here. I love the use of Zatanna in this. I'm glad that we get to see her. But again, this is another situation where I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of an emotional depth here. There is a moment in one of the later issues where Zatanna is using her, or let me couch it this way, actually. Zatanna has lost her magic ability because of the actions of Amanda Waller. And so because of that, when they're using this artifact, the MacGuffin, to navigate the dark paths, normally it feeds off of the magic within someone, within the user, but Zatanna has no magic, and so it is stealing her life force. That's something that I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of if you had revealed that earlier and sort of dealt with that throughout some of the further issues. I do think that it could have been a really, really interesting plot point, especially because we have a great interaction between Zatanna and Clark where they're talking about, Superman is talking about how he hates magic and how he doesn't like it because it seems like the rules are always changing. And there's a little back and forth, there's more conversation, and then Zatanna says, "This thing that you hate is all that I am. You know, you are Clark Kent, you're Kal-El, you're Superman. You've got 3 identities. Zatanna isn't a code name, it's my real name. It is all that I am. I am Zatanna the stage magician." And obviously this is a paraphrase, these are not her exact words. But she says something along the lines of, "Amanda Waller may have stolen your powers, but she stole my life." And that is such a good beat. That's such a good moment. And I really would have liked to have seen it dealt with a little bit more, or at least something that is maybe addressed in Jamal Campbell's Zatanna series. But there's really no ramifications of this here. The map of Mordru, the MacGuffin, is stealing her life force, and it's a really cool effect where it's got like a hashed line like in maps, Indiana Jones, or in the Marauders map from Harry Potter, to indicate where people have gone, there's little hash lines. Those are appearing all over her body because she's slowly dying. The map of Mordru is stealing her life force. But it's mentioned again for this one panel, and then we go throughout the rest of the issue. It's never addressed. There's never any question. The lines sort of disappear. And then the next time we see her, she's just completely normal. I would have liked to have seen some lasting effects from this. I think it really could have made for an interesting plot point. It's something interesting to explore further on. But of course, it's only 3 issues, and the whole universe changes after this because of the DC All-In special and all of that. But I really would have liked to have seen some more here. I really enjoy the interaction between Zatanna and Clark, and I love that we see some flashbacks throughout Clark's life of his interactions with magic. I do think it is very, very fun, and I didn't necessarily really have an affinity for Zatanna, as I talked about in my review of the first issue of Jamal Campbell's new series, but I've really, really, really grown to like her over the past, couple months since we did that. Man, has it really been? It feels like it's been a lot longer than that. That's crazy. I've been reading too many comics, I guess. But I really enjoy it. I think it's fun. Again, I just wish that these tie-in issues had maybe stood a little bit more on their own. Maybe I would have a much more positive light on them. But in any case, I don't know. Let's head into the 3rd chapter of this review, and that is the Luthor line. The ongoing thread throughout all of my reviews and all of my analyses and commentary of this ongoing Joshua Williamson run has been the fact that Lex Luthor is the main character of the book. He's just as much a main protagonist as Superman is. And so I felt like I had to talk about him here, but the thing is, he doesn't do anything, literally at all. Neither of the Luthors do anything. There is a fun interaction where they're at Supercorp, and Lex is talking about how... Okay, let me jump back a little bit. Lena Luthor, Lex Luthor, Jimmy Olsen, and Siobhan, whose last name I don't know, but the Silver Banshee, are at Supercorp because Lena says that she thought if they had brought Luthor here, maybe it would jog some memories in his brain hole and he would be able to help in the fight against Amanda Waller. But it's not working. He's not getting any memories back. And so he has this line where he's like, I wish I was the Lex that Waller thinks I was. I wish I was the man that you all think I could be. He sounds like a great man. And everybody just like sits and looks at him for a moment. There's a panel with like 3 ellipses to just, denote silence. And then Jimmy Olsen goes, right. Anyway, and I think that's a fun moment for a couple of reasons. One, it's just a little bit of comedy, playing off of Lex in a way that I think is interesting. But also, it's a completely natural response for Lex. Like at this point, he hasn't learned, he doesn't know all of the things that he has done because of course, the memory loss, and he hasn't been caught up yet. The events of this book take place really, really shortly after the House of Brainiac. And so, of course, he's sitting here, all he's hearing is these people, Superman comes up to him and is like, thanks, Lex, you were a real help there. We wouldn't have been able to do it without you. And he hears all these people saying, we need to get Lex to get his memories back so that he can devise a plan to defeat Waller. He's got Waller coming after him because he is one of the top threats on her hit list. He's got all this information, not knowing any of the context, and just being like, man, I must have been one of the best heroes on the planet. He must have been such a great man. I think it's a really, really interesting moment. But again, it's weird that throughout the whole first 15 issues, Lex has been the main character. And then in this, he's basically just there to be like, hey, we've got Lex Luthor here. It's a Superman comic. And then they just shove him off and don't necessarily do anything with him. Now, not doing anything with Lex, I understand because he has no memories. But to me, This is the perfect place to give Lena Luthor a little bit of development. Maybe Lex is unable to solve the problem, and so Lena devises a solution. Because as we talked about in the House of Brainiac review, there's a moment there where Lena, I think it's Lex, tells Lena that she has no limits to her intelligence. Not in the way that he does, not in the way that Brainiac does, because she is this sort of combination of all of them because of her past. This is the perfect time to make her an important character. But again, she really doesn't do anything. She's there for like a couple panels. She's there to bring them to Supercorp, and then she leaves, and we don't see her for the rest of the issues. And I think that's really unfortunate. Again, I think if you're doing a Lex Luthor book, if you're doing a Superman book, there needs to be a Luthor of some kind, unless there is a specific reason for them not being there. Unless it's a type of situation where it's like, we're not going to have Lex in this book because he's in prison. He's rotting away, so we don't need to address him. We don't need to talk about him. But Luthor has been an integral part in this series thus far. And so because of that, I think, again, if you're not going to have him, there needs to be an explicit reason why he is not there. And it needs to be more than a line where somebody says, we sent Lena back home. We put Lena we left Lena at her apartment. We left Lex with Lena. Whatever. So it needs to be a little bit more than that, especially because, like I said, he has been integral up until this point. I think it's very, very important. It's a weird plot thread to drop here. Because again, to me, it makes a lot of sense. Again, Lex doesn't have his memories. Have Lena devise a solution. Have Lena be the one who works with Mercy. Have Lena be the one who works with Lois, with anybody or anything to do anything of importance at all. Because up until this point, she hasn't really been used. She was in the House of Brainiac, but her role there was to be forcefully plugged into a machine and then to have Lex take her out of it. And then that's pretty much it. She's a character who I'm really interested in, I really think deserves a little bit of growth and development. But maybe I'm biased. I don't know. Let me know what you guys think about Lena Luthor, if you think she's cool. But I think that's where we're going to leave it about talking about the absolute power. There's a lot of abouts in that sentence. We're going to stop talking about the absolute power tie-ins, and now we're going to transition to talking about the Night Terror tie-ins, and that begins with Chapter 4, The Man of Screams. In the Night Terrors event, a new villain has taken over the world. They have put everybody to sleep and forced them to live out their nightmares while searches for a MacGuffin, the Nightmare Stone. All right. Now, I do think that is an interesting story conceit. It feels it's sort of supernatural, but for some reason to me it feels very Star Trek. I don't know if there's an episode where everybody in Star Trek gets put to sleep, but for some reason this seems like an episode of the original series. Now, right at the outset here, I do want to admit and clear the air and say that I have not read the entire Night Terrors event, so I don't know how any of this plays into the larger goal here, but I have read a smattering of Night Terrors tie-ins. In my research for the Superman, I think it would have been the Superwoman special, I read all the way back a bunch and read everything, including these tie-ins. When I did my Green Lantern Fractured Spectrum review, I went back and read everything up until that point of the current series. And I think I read them for Nightwing as well. And Titans, maybe? I don't know. I've read some tie-ins, but I haven't read the actual event. So this part of the review is completely unbiased, whereas perhaps my view of the Absolute Power tie-ins are biased by my unfavorable look on the Absolute Power event. So the Man of Screams himself, I think, is a really interesting character. I think that this first issue of the Night Terror tie-ins is really, really cool. We get to see Superman living out his nightmares, and we see a couple different things. We see, one, that he is not really Superman. We see a world where all of the disasters have been averted. The Perry White walks in and says, we finally ran our last headline ever, and it says, whole world saved forever or something like that. And I think that's really interesting. It's an interesting plot point to make that be the first thing that this villain thought would be Superman's worst nightmare, saying, you have no purpose as Superman anymore. Everything is saved, right? And then we do transition, and Superman's like, no, this is all a dream. It's not real. And the villain speaking through Perry White says, whoopsies, I thought we'd have a little bit longer here. And so then a massive wave crashes in. And then the second part of this nightmare sequence I think is really interesting. It's a completely different look. It's Superman. It's a look at Superman's fears as though he is the cause of all of this hardship. There's a scene where we see Krypton and we see Superman's rocket fly off the planet, and then it goes to Earth, and the manifestation of Clark's nightmares, this character who in the second issue is named the Super Reaper, and in the first issue he just refers to himself as the Man of Screams. Really cool design, by the way. Quick sidebar, really cool design. I like it a lot. They're in space, and the Man of Screams tells Superman that you didn't flee the destruction of Krypton, you brought the destruction with you. And then he destroys the planet Earth. He uses his big old scythe and slashes the planet in half. And I think that is really cool. I think it's an interesting look at Superman. I think that's one of the reasons I sort of like Scarecrow as a villain, is because when you look at these characters and make them face their worst fear, I think you get a really good insight into their psyche. And I think that this is a pretty good insight into Superman. I think it is really fun. I think it works out well. And I do like the way that we pull in Supergirl later on. In the second issue, we get a little bit more, we see a little bit of what Supergirl's nightmares were like. And then we also see that the event, which has caused everybody on the planet to go to sleep, doesn't actually affect everybody. For some reason, the Atlanteans have been spared this calamity. And it's a really cool look at the fact that everybody on the planet is wiped out. Everybody's going to sleep. And so Arthur Curry, King of Atlantis, Aquaman, he says, it is our job to protect the Earth. He says, I rule over 80% of the planet. Who better to keep it safe than its king? And I think that that's a really cool line. Even though we don't necessarily get to see him a lot throughout this, these two issues made me realize that I think it would be really cool to see Joshua Williamson's take on Aquaman. Now, that's not to say anything about the current ongoing Aquaman series. I like it a lot so far. I think Jeremy Adams is doing a great job. But I do think it would be interesting to see Joshua Williamson's take on the character. Because for these, probably a total of 5 or 6 pages that we maybe see, it's probably less than that now that I think about it, but let's just say 5 for argument's sake. These 5 pages where we see Williamson's take on Aquaman are really interesting because I do think it shows, it hits at some of the important aspects of that character of Aquaman. And I think that it's really, really cool. But I think that is where we are going to leave it today. Let me know. Actually, I guess we should probably do final thoughts first. Again, just to reiterate everything I've been saying throughout this video, I think the volume itself is pretty fun. I think it is pretty well written, but it really just does not stand on its own. If you're going to buy this volume, then I think you also have to buy the Absolute Power stuff. I think the Night Terrors thing, you can sort of just bogart that and ignore the event. The Night Terrors issues mostly stand on their own because they take place pretty much entirely in a dream sequence. But the events of the Absolute Power tie-ins directly reflect the things that happen in the issues of Absolute Power. And so for that, I do think it's a fun volume, but personally, I would not buy the volume unless you're a completionist, unless you want to have the entire run, in which case it's a good read and it looks really beautiful throughout. Let me know down below if you agree with my sentiments here, if you think I'm wrong, if you think the volume does stand on its own. Any of these responses are valid, and I will read them all. I may disagree with you fervently, but I'll read them all nonetheless and probably like a few of them. But in any case, make sure that you subscribe and hit the notifications bell so that you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes, which are... On next Tuesday, we're going to be talking about Jurassic World Dominion, the third and final movie of the second Jurassic World trilogy. And then we're going to be back here next week to talk about what I think is the greatest Green Lantern run of all time. It's pure coincidence that it happens to fall on the exact 1-year anniversary of when I began reading Green Lantern. But I'm really excited. I'm going to have a lot of things to talk about, and there's going to be a lot of willpower in that episode. So stay tuned for those. And again, if you like what we do here and want to help us out, head on over to patreon.com/newwavenerds. And I will see you guys next Tuesday to talk about Jurassic World.